You are watching the Neuro-Affirming Conversation Hour for outreach and support. The Humanities 101 Foundation welcomes you.
Hello, my friends, and welcome back to NACHOS, the Neuro-Affirming Conversation Hour for outreach and support. I want to welcome you back to the final episode for this season. But before we begin, I want to pause with a quote from philosopher and psychologist Erich Fromm. Erich Fromm said, "Once they are through the process of education, most people lose the capacity of wondering, of being surprised. They feel they ought to know everything, and hence that it is a sign of ignorance to be surprised or puzzled by anything." So again, once they are through the process of education, most people lose the capacity of wondering, of being surprised. They feel they ought to know everything, and hence that it is a sign of ignorance to be surprised or puzzled by anything. And that quote feels especially fitting for a season finale because so much of what we've tried to do here is to recover the courage to wonder, to ask questions without being embarrassed that we do not already know the answers, to remain curious about ourselves, about other people, and about the world that we are still becoming, really. Education is supposed to open our minds, but sometimes it teaches us to hide our uncertainty. We learn to perform confidence. We learn to pretend that confusion is weakness. We begin to believe that intelligent people always have an answer ready. But wonder begins where certainty ends. Surprise is not proof that we've failed to understand the world. Sometimes it's proof that we're still paying attention to the world. To be puzzled is to notice that something doesn't quite fit. To be curious is to believe that there may be more to learn. And to be surprised is to remain open to the possibility that the world, other people, and even we ourselves can still become something unexpected. So as we begin this final episode of the season, I don't want us to tie everything into a perfect bow. I want us to make room for the unfinished questions, for the ideas that still challenge us, and for the possibilities we have not yet imagined. Because perhaps the goal of education is not to reach a place where nothing surprises us. Perhaps the goal is to become wise enough, humble enough, and awake enough to keep wondering. And this is where the Dunning-Kruger effect can help us understand Fromm's warning a little more clearly. The Dunning-Kruger effect describes a common human tendency. When people know only a little about a subject, they may feel more confident than their knowledge actually justifies. They've learned enough to form an opinion, but not yet enough to recognize the complexity, exceptions, and unanswered questions surrounding it. As people continue learning, something important often happens. Their confidence becomes more measured because they begin to see how much they have overlooked. The subject that once seemed simple becomes layered and complicated. They discover contradictions. They encounter perspectives they never considered. They become more aware of the limits of their own understanding. That growing awareness is not a sign that education has failed. It's evidence that deeper learning is taking place. True wisdom is not found in believing that we have mastered everything. It's found in wonder, in amazement, in the ability to recognize that we do not, in fact, know everything. Wisdom allows us to say, I may be wrong. It gives us the courage to ask another question, listen to another perspective, and change our minds when new evidence appears. Wonder is not childish. It's intellectual humility. And honestly, it's much needed in this world. Amazement is not ignorance. It's openness. And it too is needed in this world. And uncertainty is not always weakness. Sometimes it's the beginning of real understanding. The wisest people I know are rarely those who insist that they have all the answers. They're often the people who have learned enough to appreciate the size of the mystery. And in many ways, That's the entire point of higher education, especially the humanities. Higher education is not supposed to be a factory that produces people who can recite the right things with confidence. It should teach us how to live with difficult questions. It should train us how to examine our assumptions, recognize the limits of our own perspectives, and remain open to the possibility that the world is more complicated than we first imagined. The humanities asks us to sit in that complexity. History reminds us that the present was not always inevitable. Literature allows us to enter lives, cultures, and experiences beyond our own. Philosophy asks us to question the ideas we've inherited about truth, justice, beauty, freedom, and what it means to live a quote-unquote good life. Art teaches us that meaning cannot always be reduced to formula. And the study of religion, language, culture, and human behavior reminds us that people have been wrestling with the same essential questions for thousands of years. And often, they reach completely and utterly different answers. The value of the humanities is not that they hand us a single permanent solution. Their value is that they make us better questioners. They teach us how to ask who is missing from this story, whose perspective has been treated as universal and whose has been treated as fringe. What assumptions are shaping this system? What might another person see that I cannot? And what do we owe one another as human beings? Those questions do not always make life simpler. In fact, they often make it more complicated. But the complication is part of becoming educated. A meaningful education should disrupt some of the certainty. It should make us feel less comfortable with easy explanations and more attentive to nuance. It should also help us recognize that intelligence is not demonstrated by how quickly we dismiss a question, but by how seriously we're willing to explore it. And that's why wonder matters so much. Without wonder, education becomes memorization. Without humility, knowledge becomes performance. Without curiosity, expertise can harden into arrogance. But when education preserves our capacity to be surprised, it keeps us intellectually alive. It allows us to return to familiar ideas and see them differently. The same old movie, the same old book, the same old song, the same old theory. It helps us meet other people not as problems to be solved, but as worlds to be encountered. Perhaps the greatest outcome of higher education is not certainty at all. Perhaps it's the development of a mind that remains open, a heart that remains teachable, and a person who can move through the world and say, there is more here than I understand. There's something here worth noticing, and I'm still willing to learn. And that kind of humility was not limited to students or beginners, or people standing on the edges of knowledge. Even history's greatest thinkers understood that learning requires us to remain curious. Consider Einstein. We often remember him as the very image of a genius. I mean, honestly, it's the 20th century's fabrication of the image of a genius, a person whose name has become shorthand for extraordinary intelligence. Yet Einstein did not approach the universe as though he had conquered it. He approached it with questions, imagination, and awe. Near the end of his life, he reflected, the important thing is not to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existence. One cannot help but be in awe when he contemplates the mystery of eternity, of life, of the marvelous structure of reality. It is enough if one tries merely to comprehend a little of this mystery each day. What is so powerful about that quote is that Einstein does not describe curiosity as a stage that we outgrow. He describes it as something essential to an intellectually meaningful life. Questioning was not what stood in the way of his intelligence. It was part of what made his intelligence possible. Einstein understood that the universe was not something that could be conquered by certainty. It was something that needed to be approached with humility, imagination, and awe. The more he learned, the more he recognized that reality remained larger than any one theory, any one answer, or any one singular human mind. And that's an important reminder for all of us, because we often confuse intelligence with certainty. We imagine that brilliant people move through the world with perfect confidence, never doubting themselves and never needing to revise what they believe. But genuine discovery rarely works that way. Discovery requires uncertainty. It requires patience. It requires the willingness to follow an idea before knowing where it will lead. It requires us to notice what doesn't fit and to resist the temptation to dismiss it simply because it complicates the story that we've already learned or understood. Einstein's genius was not only that he could solve difficult math equations. It was that he could remain fascinated by math itself. He could look at familiar assumptions and ask whether they were actually true. He could imagine possibilities that others had overlooked, and he could tolerate the discomfort of not knowing long enough for a new way of understanding to emerge. That connection between curiosity, imagination, and discovery is not merely an inspiring story we tell about Einstein after the fact. Researchers continue to study how he thought, how he learned, and how his willingness to use imagination shaped his scientific work. And some of that research gives us a more complicated and perhaps even more useful picture of what genius actually looks like. And so this brings us to a fascinating new piece of research connected to Einstein's most famous supposed mistake. Einstein's equations of general relativity originally suggested that the universe could not remain perfectly still. Gravity would eventually cause it to contract. But Einstein believed, as many scientists did at the time, that the universe was static, unchanging on the largest scale. So he added something to his equation called the cosmological constant. You can think of it as a kind of repulsive energy built into empty space, pushing outward against gravity and allowing the universe to remain stable. Then astronomer Edwin Hubble, you know his name, produced evidence that the universe was not static at all. It was expanding. Einstein removed the cosmological constant from his equation, and he widely reported to have later called it, its introduction, his biggest blunder. Although the exact history of that phrase is a little less certain than popular retellings, but Einstein, that's the cult of personality of the 20th century. But this is where the story becomes so wonderfully human and so connected to everything we've been discussing. In 1998, scientists discovered that the universe was not merely expanding, its expansion was accelerating. Suddenly, the idea that Einstein had discarded became relevant again. Some form of energy associated with empty space appeared necessary to explain what astronomers were observing. The so-called blunder had returned. And now new research from physicists at Brown University suggests that the strange mathematics of the universe may have helped explain why the cosmological constant remained this stable and extraordinarily small instead of becoming unimaginably large. To understand that problem, we need to know that modern physics relies upon two enormously successful, but yet not fully compatible ways of describing reality. General relativity explains gravity, space, time, planets, stars, and the large-scale structure of the universe. But quantum field theory describes particles and forces at incredibly small scales. Quantum field theory tells us that empty space is not truly empty. It's filled with constant quantum activity. Particles and energy fluctuate in and out of existence. According to the calculations, all of that activity should produce an enormous amount of energy in empty space, and therefore an enormous cosmological constant. But when scientists observe the universe, they find that the cosmological constant is incredibly small. That disagreement between theory and observation is known as the cosmological constant problem, and it remains one of the deepest puzzles in modern physics. If the constant were as large as some quantum calculations suggest, the universe would have expanded so violently that galaxies, stars, planets, and human beings would never have formed. The Brown researchers have now proposed that the mathematical structure or topology of space-time itself may protect the cosmological constant from those enormous quantum disturbances. Topology is the study of the underlying shape and structure of things. In this case, the researchers found a surprising mathematical connection between a proposed model of quantum gravity and something called the quantum Hall effect. Now, in which this electrical measurements remain remarkably stable even when the material involved contains imperfections. The researchers suggest that something similar could be happening at the level of the universe. The structure of space-time may effectively lock the cosmological constant into certain stable values, preventing quantum fluctuations from pushing it towards infinity. Now, this is still a proposed explanation. It's not the final answer. The researchers themselves emphasize that much more work is required, and that may be the most important part of this story for us. Because science does not advance because brilliant people never make mistakes. Science advances because people remain willing to revisit ideas, reconsider assumptions, connect knowledge from different fields, and admit that the story is unfinished. Einstein introduced the cosmological constant because he believed the universe had to be static. Then he abandoned it when new evidence challenged that belief. Later generations then came along, brought it back when still more evidence revealed that the universe's expansion was accelerating. And now another group of researchers is asking whether the mathematics of an entirely different quantum phenomenon might help us understand why Einstein's old constant behaves as it does. And that's wonder in action. It's not a straight line from ignorance to certainty. It's a continuing conversation between ideas, evidence, mistakes, corrections, and new questions. In fact, the researchers said they look at an older and relatively conservative approach to quantum gravity and discovered something new that may have been present within it all along. Their progress also depends upon scholars from different specialties working together. A cosmologist collaborating with a condensed matter theorist because each could recognize something the other might miss. And that's another lesson for higher education. Knowledge grows when disciplines speak with one another. It grows when physicists remain curious about mathematics developed in another area. It grows when historians question inherited stories. It grows when artists reveal patterns that statistics cannot capture. It grows when we stop treating our own corner of knowledge as the entire universe. Hello, colleagues. I know, again, it's finals time for students, so I know your professor is treating his or her class as if it's the only one that exists. Maybe Einstein's biggest blunder was never simply a blunder. Maybe it was one step in a much longer and larger human attempt to understand something that remains larger than us. An idea can be wrong for the reasons we first embraced it and still contain something valuable. A question can outlive the person who first asked it, and a mistake can become fertile ground for discoveries that could not yet have been imagined. That doesn't mean that every error is secretly correct. It means that intellectual humility allows us to return to abandoned ideas and ask better questions of them. Einstein did not give us the final understanding of the universe. He helped us see that the universe was stranger than we'd previously imagined, and perhaps that's what the greatest education does for any of us. It doesn't eliminate mystery. It teaches us how to stand before the mystery with curiosity rather than fear, and to keep asking what might be there and digging to find it. And this question of whether the universe preserves information leads us into another and even more speculative new idea. What if the universe does not merely contain a history? What if the universe physically remembers history? A recent published article describes a theoretical framework called the quantum memory matrix, or QMM. The basic proposal is that information may be more fundamental than matter, energy, or even space-time itself. Rather than imagining space-time as perfectly smooth, the theory pictures it as being made of unimaginably tiny cells. Each cell would be capable of storing a quantum imprint of the particles, forces, and interactions that pass through it. In other words, every event leaves a trace. The universe would not simply move from one moment to the next and discard what came before. Its history would become part of its structure. Cosmological epigenetics, if you will. Now, it's important to be clear. This is not an established explanation of the universe. It is a developing theoretical framework, and several of its major claims remain unconfirmed and are still undergoing peer review. But it's valuable precisely because it asks us to look at a familiar problem from a radically different direction. One of those problems is the black hole information paradox. We were just talking about the universe expanding and contracting and whatnot. According to Einstein's general theory of relativity, matter that falls into a black hole can appear to disappear beyond the event horizon. But quantum mechanics tells us that information should never be completely destroyed. And those two conclusions don't fit neatly together. The quantum memory matrix proposes that that information carried by matter is not lost inside the black hole. Instead, the surrounding cells of space-time record an imprint of it, a copy. Even if the black hole eventually evaporates it, takes it all in, the information would remain written into the fabric of the universe. And that alone is an astonishing possibility. But the researchers take that idea further. They suggest that accumulations of these informational imprints might behave gravitationally like dark matter. Dark matter is the name that we give to something we cannot directly see, but whose gravitational effects appear throughout the universe. Galaxies rotate as though they contain far more mass than we can observe. The standard explanation is that invisible forms of matter surround and hold those galaxies together. In this new framework, some of that effect might instead come from concentrations of information stored in space-time. These clusters of cosmic memory would pull on ordinary matter gravitationally, even though they would not be made from the conventional particles in the usual sense. The theory also offers a possible account of dark energy, the name given to whatever appears to be driving the accelerated expansion of the universe. The proposal is that space-time has a limited capacity to store new information, kind of like a cache. As its microscopic scales become increasingly saturated with information, they may contribute to a kind of residual energy. According to the researchers, that leftover energy takes the same mathematical form as the cosmological constant we just discussed, the constant associated with the accelerating expansion of the universe. So within this one model, dark matter and dark energy might not be two completely unrelated mysteries. They could be two different consequences of the universe storing its own history. Dark matter would reflect the gravitational influence of accumulated information, and dark energy would emerge as the memory's capacity of space-time as it becomes increasingly filled. Again, this is a hypothesis, it's not settled fact, but notice what this theory is doing. It's asking some of the most difficult questions in physics, and it's taking those questions and asking whether we've been beginning with the wrong fundamental ingredients. And that's kind of crazy. Perhaps matter is not the deepest level of reality. Perhaps energy is not the deepest level. Perhaps even space and time are not the deepest level. Perhaps information comes first. And that possibility has consequences for how we imagine the history and future of the entire cosmos. The researchers suggest that if the universe has a finite capacity for information, then it may move through repeated cycles of expansion and contraction. As information and disorder accumulate, a contracting universe might eventually reach a limit. Instead of collapsing into an infinitely dense singularity, it could rebound or bounce into another period of expansion. One related paper proposes observing consequences involving primordial black holes, gravitational waves, and the cosmological microwave background and other measurements that could eventually test parts of this framework. And that means the universe might not have begun only once. That's crazy. Our present cosmos could be one chapter in a much longer story. The researchers even estimate within their model that the universe may have passed through several earlier cycles, but those numbers depend entirely upon the theory being correct. And that's always the rub. So we should treat them as mathematical predictions to be tested, not as a newly established age of the universe. So this returns us to that theme of wonder. We often speak about knowledge as though the goal were to reduce everything to something familiar. We want the universe to behave like a machine. We want every effect to have a clearly visible object or reason behind it. We want reality to fit into the categories we've already created. But this theory asks us to consider a universe that is not merely a machine or an equation. It may also be an archive, a memory system, perhaps even a kind of cosmic information processor in which every interaction contributes to what the universe becomes next. And there's something deeply human about that. Our memories, for instance, do not merely record our lives. They shape how we interpret the present. They influence our choices, our reactions, our relationships, our fears, our expectations. The past remains active inside of us. This theory imagines something simpler happening on the scale of the cosmos. The universe's past would not simply be gone. Its previous events would continue to affect its structure, its gravity, its expansion, and perhaps even its future. But again, we should also be careful not to turn this metaphor into more than science claims. The theory is not saying that the universe remembers in the way a human mind remembers. It's not claiming that space-time has consciousness or nostalgia or even personal awareness. Here, memory means that information from earlier interactions remains physically encoded or continues to influence conditions. And that distinction is part of intellectual humility too. Wonder does not require us to abandon precision. Imagination does not mean accepting every beautiful idea as fact. The responsible response is not, this must be true because it's fascinating. The responsible response is, this is fascinating, so how now do we test it? This is where science and the humanities meet. Because ask us to imagine possibilities, and both ask us to examine the assumptions beneath our existing explanations. Beyond that, both ask us to distinguish between what we know, what we infer, what we hope, and what we still need to investigate. And perhaps this new theory will fail. Perhaps future observations will reveal that the universe doesn't work this way at all. But even then, the question still has value. Because new knowledge often begins when someone becomes willing to ask whether reality could be organized differently than we've assumed. Einstein asked us to imagine gravity not simply as a force pulling objects together, but as the curvature of space and time itself. These researchers are asking whether the curvature might also contain information, whether the universe carries traces of everything that has happened within it. And that's not certainty. That's not a final answer. It's an invitation to question and wonder. And sometimes the willingness to imagine a different universe is the first step towards actually understanding the one that we inhabit today. So after looking outward towards black holes and expanding universes, we now return to something much more closer to home. our human bodies. Because sometimes wonder doesn't begin with discovering something far away. Sometimes it begins by realizing that we may have misunderstood what's possible within us. For generations, scientists have generally treated the inability of humans and other mammals to regrow complex body parts as a basic biological limitation of our existence. Salamanders can regenerate limbs. Humans heal wounds, but we usually do so by forming scar tissue. And that seemed to be the rule. But new research from Texas A&M suggests that the regenerative capacity of mammals may not be entirely absent. And I'll throw this up on the screen for you. Boo. There we go. The study published in Nature Communications tested a 2-stage treatment in mice after digit amputation. Researchers were able to redirect the normal healing process and stimulate the regrowth of bone, joint structures, tendons, and even ligaments. The regenerative anatomy was not a perfect copy of what had been lost, but the major skeletal and connective tissue components reappeared. And to understand why this is so surprising, we need to understand what usually happens when mammals are injured. Our body's first priority is almost always survival. Cells called fibroblasts move into the injured area and help seal the wound by producing scar tissue. This process, called fibrosis, is extremely useful. It closes the body quickly, helps protect against infection, and prevents further damage. But there's a trade-off. Scar formation closes the wound without fully rebuilding what was lost. Animals capable of extensive regeneration respond differently. Like salamanders, for instance. Their cells gather near the injury and form something called a blastema, a collection of cells that becomes basically a foundation for new tissue. And the Texas A&M researchers asked whether mammalian cells could also be capable of moving in that direction. Perhaps the cells were not incapable of regeneration. Perhaps they were simply receiving different instructions. The researchers used 2 naturally occurring growth factors in sequence. First, after the wound had already been closed, they applied fibroblast growth factor 2, and that treatment encouraged the formation of a blastema-like structure. Several days later, they applied bone morphogenetic protein 2, or BMP2, and that second signal helped direct those cells toward rebuilding specific structures. The first step shifted the response away from scar formation. The second told the cells what to build. And that distinction is fascinating. The scientists did not bring an entirely new population of cells from outside the body to build this. They worked with what was already present there. Cells once thought to be fixed in their roles appeared capable of being redirected. Old dogs, new trick. The researchers also found evidence of what is known as positional respecification, meaning cells could be instructed to help form structures beyond the roles or locations normally expected of them. In other words, the capacity was not necessarily missing. The conditions for expressing it were. And that doesn't mean human beings are about to regrow arms or legs. This was an animal study involving mouse digits. The structures that regenerated were imperfect, and the work remains at a very, very early stage. But there still is great distance between producing this result in mice and developing safe, effective treatments for humans. But the study has immediate implications. Even before complete regeneration becomes possible, the same principles could potentially help researchers reduce scarring, improve wound healing, and encourage more functional tissue repair. One of the growth factors used, that BMP2, already has approval for certain medical implications, while the FGF2 is being studied in clinical trials. And once again, notice what made the discovery possible. Researchers questioned a category that had begun to feel permanent. Mammals scar, salamanders regenerate. This is known. This is a divide. This is fact. But instead of accepting the divide as absolute, the scientists ask a different question. What if mammalian healing and regeneration are not completely separate abilities? What if there are two possible directions within the same biological process? What if the body already contains some of the tools, but normally chooses speed and protection over perfection and rebuilding? That's the power of wonder. Wonder does not simply ask, what can this organism do? It asks, what might it be capable of doing under different conditions? And that question reaches far beyond biology. We often confuse what a person currently does with what a person is capable of doing. We observe someone struggling in one environment and conclude that the limitation exists entirely within them. A student cannot focus in the classroom. A worker cannot succeed under this new management style. A disabled person cannot participate in this space. A child cannot communicate in a way that we expect. And then we treat the result as fixed evidence of incapacity. But what if, like the cells in this study, people respond differently when the signals around them change? What if the capacity is not absent? What if it is obscured by the environment? What if someone who appears unable to succeed has simply been placed in conditions that continually direct their energy towards protection rather than growth? That doesn't mean biology and human experience are identical. We should not turn a medical finding into an oversimplified metaphor for a podcast, but the study does offer us a useful way to think. The body's ordinary response to injury is not foolish. Scar tissue protects it. The body closes quickly because an open wound is dangerous. And in the same way, many human responses that appear unproductive may have begun as forms of protection. Withdrawal, masking, avoidance, silence, rigid routines, the reluctance to trust. These responses may help a person survive an environment that is not felt safe, predictable, or accommodating. But survival and restoration are not the same things. Scar tissue closes the wound. Regeneration attempts to rebuild what was lost. And perhaps this is one of the great questions facing education, medicine, workplaces, homes, families, and communities. Are we merely helping people survive the conditions around them, or are we creating the conditions in which something more can grow? Because changing the outcome may require more than demanding greater effort from the individual. It may require changing the signals, the timing, the environments, the supports, changing what we assume is even possible. Now, these researchers didn't shame the cells for creating scar tissue. They changed the conditions directing the cell's behavior. And there's a profound lesson in that. We often approach human difficulty by asking, what's wrong with that person? But a more curious question might be, what is that person responding to? What conditions are shaping this outcome? What capacities might appear if the environment communicated something different? That's the logic behind accommodation, universal design. That's the logic behind trauma-informed practice, neuro-affirming education, and humane leadership. A ramp doesn't create a person's ability to enter a building. It allows that person's ability to be expressed. Captions do not create a person's capacity to understand. They make the information available in a useful form. Predictability does not manufacture competence. It can reduce the energy spent on uncertainty so that competence has room to emerge. Support doesn't give people value. It helps create the conditions in which their existing value, knowledge, and capacity can become visible to others. And this is why the research connects so powerfully to the larger theme of this episode. Because Fromm warned us that education can sometimes train people to hide their uncertainty. The Dunning-Kruger effect reminds us that shallow knowledge can produce excessive confidence. Einstein reminds us not to stop questioning. The cosmological research reminds us that an abandoned idea may return in a new form. Theories of cosmic memory ask whether the past remains encoded in the structure of reality. The gravastar hypothesis asks whether collapse might contain the beginning of expansion. And now regenerative biology asks whether an ability we assumed was absent may have been instead hidden. Each story challenges a boundary. Each begins with something asking whether the accepted explanation is complete. Not necessarily wrong, not useless, but incomplete. And that may be one of the most important habits we can carry with us. When we encounter a limitation, we should take it seriously, but we should not always assume that we have correctly identified where the limitation resides. Sometimes the barrier is the body, sometimes it's the environment, sometimes it's in the timing or even in the instructions sent. And sometimes it's in the imagination of the people who decided too quickly what could never happen. The most responsible response is not to promise miracles. This study does not prove that humans can regenerate limbs. It doesn't erase the realities of disability or suggest that every body should be expecting to become something different. The point is not that every form of human difference needs to be cured. The point is that knowledge remains unfinished. Bodies are more complicated than our categories. Healing is more complicated than closing a wound. Capacity is more complicated than present performance. And possibility is often larger than we've already witnessed. And perhaps that's the final lesson connecting all of this research. Wonder asks us to remain open without becoming careless, to imagine without pretending, to hope without exaggerating, to respect the evidence while also recognizing that evidence always continues to grow. It allows us to say, this is what we currently understand. This is what this study actually showed, and this is what remains uncertain. And then finally, hopefully, this is the new question we are now able to ask. And that's not ignorance to be embarrassed by. That's wisdom. Because the point of knowledge is not to make the universe or the human body or another person seem small enough for us to master. The point is to help us see more clearly how much complexity, possibility, and mystery were there all along. So as we bring these ideas together, we can see that each part of today's conversation has been pointing towards the same larger truth. Education should not eliminate wonder. It should deepen it. We began with Fromm's warning that many people leave education believing that they should already know everything, and that being surprised, confused, or uncertain is somehow a sign of failure. Then we connected that idea with the Dunning-Kruger effect, which reminds us that people with limited knowledge may sometimes feel they are the most certain, while deeper learning often makes us more aware of the complexity, contradiction, and even limitations of our own understanding. That's why true wisdom is not the performance of certainty. It's the ability to remain curious, to say, I don't know, to ask another question, to listen to another perspective, to recognize that there may be more here than we currently see. We then considered how this is one of those central purposes of higher education in the humanities. The humanities does not simply give us information. The humanities teaches us how to think with uncertainty. History shows us that the present was not inevitable. Literature lets us encounter lives and experiences beyond our own. Philosophy teaches us how to challenge our assumptions. Art reminds us that meaning cannot always be reduced to a formula. And together, all of these fields make us better questioners. They teach us not only to ask what is true, but whose truth has been centered, whose truth has been left out, and what assumptions are shaping that story. And even what possibilities have yet to be imagined. Einstein gave us another example of this intellectual humility. He understood that curiosity was not something we outgrew once we become educated. It was part of what made the discovery possible. His work reminds us that even the greatest thinkers did not move through the world believing they'd mastered it. They remained fascinated by what they could not yet explain. And the research we explored brought that lesson to life. We saw how Einstein's cosmological constant, once treated as a mistake, returned as a crucial part of modern efforts to understand the accelerating universe. We considered the possibility that the universe may physically preserve information, carrying its own history in the structure of space-time. We explored the idea that some collapsing stars may not end in singularities, but could instead form gravastars, objects containing expansion within the collapse. And finally, we looked at research suggesting that mammalian regeneration may not be entirely absent, but more so dormant, waiting for the different signals, different timing, or different conditions. Yes, these studies are different. One examines the largest structure of the universe. Another examines space-time. One looking at dying stars. Another looks at how cells respond to injury. But each asks us whether the accepted explanation is complete. Each begins with someone being willing to wonder. What if empty space is not truly empty? What if the universe remembers? What if the capacity we assumed was missing is simply waiting for the right conditions? And those questions matter beyond science. They matter in education. They matter in disability. They matter in leadership, in relationships, in families, in communities, and even in the way that we understand one another. Because we often mistake present performance for permanent capacity. We see what someone can do in one environment and assume we discovered the limits of that person. But the research reminds us to ask a more thoughtful question. What conditions are shaping what we're seeing? What barriers are consuming someone's energy? What signals are they receiving? What might become possible if the environment changed? That doesn't mean every limitation disappears. It doesn't mean that every hopeful idea is true. It doesn't mean that wonder should replace evidence. It means that evidence and wonder belong together. Wonder helps us imagine the question. Evidence helps us test the answer. Humility helps us revise what we believe when the answer changes. And perhaps that's the kind of larger lesson of all of this. We don't need to know everything in order to live thoughtfully. We don't need to perfect certainty in order to move forward. We don't need to eliminate every mystery before we can act with compassion, act with curiosity, and act with courage. We simply need to remain teachable, to keep noticing, to keep asking, to keep making room for surprise, because wisdom is not reaching the point where nothing puzzles us anymore. Wisdom is understanding enough to know that there will always be things that puzzle you. There will always be more to learn. And remaining open enough to be amazed by what comes next. So before we wrap up this final episode of this season here, this is your last call to enter the NACHOS summer concert ticket giveaway. This is the final week to enter, and we're talking about some of the biggest, most in-demand shows coming to Pine Knob. Sold-out concerts like Hilary Duff, Luke Bryant, Hank Williams Jr., Lil Wayne, and more are all up for grabs. These are the shows that people have been trying to get into. Tickets have been sold out for a while. Tickets are hard to find or being scalped at enormously crazy prices. And next week, I'm going to be giving these tickets out for free. So I don't assume that you're going to remember this later. Don't wait until the deadline gets closer. Go now to humanities101.org/giveaway. Follow the instructions on the page, submit your entry, and make sure you're officially in the running. You can be headed to Pine Knob next week for one of the hottest sold-out concerts of the summer, but you cannot win if you do not enter. So this is the last week to enter in the drawing. Check out humanities101.org/giveaway to get your entry in and share the giveaway with your friends, family, and fellow Nacho Knots. Your summer concert night could just be one entry away. And while you're entering the giveaway, this is also a perfect time to make sure that you're connected with us in many different ways. Because again, We want to make sure that we're reaching as many people as we can and in many ways as we can. So take a moment. If you liked this episode, subscribe to the channel, follow the podcast, share Nachos with somebody who might need this conversation. A simple like, comment, or share helps people discover this community, and it helps this community grow. So as the season comes to a close, we're going to be transitioning this into a little bit of a summer break for a couple weeks. And in the coming months, we're going to be transitioning kind of in general. This time is going to be used to prepare for the upcoming lecture tour across Central Asia and to begin laying groundwork for next summer's book tour. There's a great deal ahead, and I want all of the Nacho Knots to be a part of it. So make sure you're subscribed, turn on those notifications, and follow Humanities 101 across all the socials, so that we can kind of keep you updated, give you some behind the scenes, some travel reflections, some new research, special announcements, and the return of Nachos. The season may be ending, but the conversation is not. This is simply a pause before the next chapter begins. I'm going to take a little stretch and a break. I mean, I'm headed to Lansing immediately for a 2-day meeting, followed by another 2 days of meetings. So I'm not stopping, but Nachos needs to take a little pause. So we've talked about wonder. We talked about humility, curiosity, uncertainty, and the courage to remain teachable. We've seen that wisdom is not found in pretending to know everything. It's found in staying open to what has not yet been discovered. So take a breath, settle in, and repeat these affirmations with me. Take what you need and leave the rest. I do not need to know everything to be wise. I can be uncertain and still move forward. I will remain curious about the world, about others, and especially about myself. I will not confuse confidence with understanding. I will ask questions without shame. I will allow new evidence to change my mind. I will stay open to perspectives beyond my own. I will remember that wonder is not weakness. I will let amazement keep me awake to possibility. I will question assumptions that others treat as permanent. I will look beyond present performance before deciding what someone can become. I will ask what barriers, environments, and conditions may be shaping what I see. I will not mistake survival for failure. I will make room for growth, healing, and new beginnings. I will respect what is known while remaining open to what is still unknown. I will imagine boldly, examine carefully, and speak honestly. I will remain teachable. I will remain humble. I will remain willing to be surprised. And I will carry my sense of wonder with me into whatever comes next. So with that, Nacho Knots, I will see you again in a few weeks with new stories, new research, new adventures, and plenty to catch up on. For now, I'm headed to Lansing for Breaking Barriers, and I cannot wait to come back and tell you all about it, what I've learned, who I've met, and the moments that stayed with me. But for now, I want to thank you for being part of this season, for showing up with curiosity, and for continuing to build this community with me. This isn't a goodbye. It's just a little pause before the next adventure. I'm going to see you in a few weeks. So until we meet again, remember, you're not a machine. Rest is not something you have to earn. Your needs are not inconveniences. Your differences are not failures. And you are already enough exactly as you are. As always, may you find a little more predictability to help you feel grounded, a little more balance to help you move through the world with greater ease, and a little more joy to remind you that life is still full of possibility. Take care of yourselves. Take care of one another. Keep asking questions. Keep making room for wonder, and keep imagining a world that works better for all of us. Until then, Nacho Knots, stay curious, stay compassionate, and keep becoming.
Thank you for joining us. See you next week. The views and opinions expressed in this video are solely those of the creator and do not reflect the views of any institution, employer, or affiliated organization.